Hello and welcome to another episode of Taylor Tries to Teach You Things, better known as TTTTYT. Oh man, I don't know why I thought that was funny, but it just sounds funny. TTTTYT. It's going to be the new acronym for this. So today we are going to try to teach you some things. So on this channel, there's a lot of times where I'm setting up my cars and I say stuff like, oh, you know, we changed to the spring rate, so we've got to increase the ride height and we need this longer shock with this different valving. And I realized I haven't really ever explained what any of that means. And a lot of you have asked, can you explain drift car suspension setup, and things like that. So I've got some work to do to the LS Miata today to get the setup dialed in. We went and did some drift testing yesterday. And figured out some things we like and don't like about the current setup, and we want to change it. So I figured now was a good time for me to kind of walk you guys through the thought process, how you determine these things, what like a general drift car suspension setup is, kind of like a blanket setup that works for just about everything, and all of that stuff. So a little backstory about me, if you guys don't know, I worked at BC Racing for 5 years, which is a coilover company. I worked in the tech department there, so I'd spec out coilovers for, you know, track cars, drift cars, sponsored drivers, and things like that. I am not at all an engineer, but I do have a lot of first-hand experience with my own vehicles and other drivers' vehicles as far as getting their suspension dialed in to pull from, basically. So that is what we're going off of here. So first thing I got to do before we get going is get the GC out and bring the Miata down so we can start working on it. So the first thing we're going to be covering today is coilovers. Coilovers are the backbone of your suspension setup. So with coilovers, how did we get to here? So let's cover that first. So you're going to start by coming up with a baseline spring rate, shock length, valving profile that you're going to run that you think is what's going to be ideal for what you're doing. So there's multiple ways to do this. There's formulas, which we won't get into the exact formulas, but basically for track cars, you can shoot for a hertz frequency. So basically data shows that if you're driving a complete stock street car, you want to be between 0.5 and 1. And then if it's a moderate track car, maybe 1 to 1.8. And then if it's a heavier track car with downforce, you know, maybe 2 to 2.5. So if you know that number, you can then plug in your car information into a formula. So the weight of the car, motion ratio, downforce, things like that. And then you can come up with a baseline spring rate. So you can do that for drifting, but there's not as much of a defined number that you're shooting for, right? So you don't have like kind of a guideline saying if your car is set up for this, you're probably going to shoot for this. But we just kind of through experience come up with a ideal spring rate for what we're doing. Now there's a lot of factors here. If I wasn't running a front sway bar, I would need a drastically stiffer front spring. I am running a front sway bar, I've upgraded front sway bar, so I'm able to drop the spring rate down a little bit. Sorry about the bird noises. So drifting is a sport of interpretation. So you could say, I want this drift car setup, but drift car setup could mean different things to different people. Drift car setup to one person could mean the car has no rear grip and is really easy to slide, right? But to someone like me and a lot of people you see who drive a lot and are tandeming and things like that, and then obviously, especially at a competitive level, what a drift car setup is basically as much rear grip as possible with the car still being drivable at its power level. So for this car, we kind of went full tilt. So we're looking for mechanical grip. So we want the suspension of the car to make as much grip as possible, because the more grip the suspension of the car makes, the less we're demanding out of the tire. So if we had a suspension setup in this car that didn't make really any mechanical grip, we would have to run Look at all that tire. We'd have to run a super crazy tire to have any grip or control or speed. Whereas the more mechanical grip we can build in, the more we can get out of less tire. So like right now I'm running 205 5015s. They are, you know, a semi-slick compound, so they're 200 tread wear. I've been working on getting the mechanical grip set up in the car so that this tire will make the car fast enough to keep up with a faster car on a bigger tire. Basically, what you want for a rear grip is just soft. You want softer rear suspension so that the car wants to weight transfer to the rear and put all that weight on the back tire. So I have a 4K spring right now. From testing, that 4K might be too soft. So that's another interesting thing, right? So generally what you're gonna wanna do is control your dive and your squat with spring rate. And then you wanna control your body roll with sway bars. So if for whatever reason you can't run a sway bar or something like that, you're going to have to take from one to make the other work. So you're gonna have to go with like a stiffer front spring, which might not have the dive characteristics you want. But you know, it controls the body roll. So it's kind of all in give and take. So with this car, we have a stock rear sway bar because we don't want that much rear sway bar resistance. And then we have a upgraded front bar, right? So we have 9K front springs, 4K rear springs. Let me get the wheels off and then we'll talk about why the 4K might be a little too soft. I'll see a lot of people that'll say something like, hey, my friend has 24K springs on his IS300. I want to run that on my 240. The thing people don't realize when they're thinking about that factor is an IS300 with 24K springs is completely different than a 240 with 24K springs. Not just because of the weight, because of motion ratio. That's the biggest factor. So on a McPherson strut car, let's go to the front. On a McPherson strut car, there is no upper control arm. The shock is basically the upright keeping the wheel from going in and out. That's why you have camber plates that allow you to bring the wheel in or out at the top. So the shock bolts here to the knuckle itself, right? On an A-arm car, you have a lower control arm and you have a upper control arm. So this upper control arm and this lower control arm are what are gonna control your camber. So you push the lower out, you gain negative camber, you pull the lower in, you gain positive camber. So same with the upper, but reverse. So you push the upper out, positive, pull it in, negative, right? That is also why you don't have camber plates on a Miata or an IS300 or a GS or, you know, any A-arm car, because they wouldn't do anything. Like a 350Z, all they would do is change the angle of the shock, because the shock bolts to the lower control arm. So if you imagine if you tilted this, you're just gonna tilt it. It's not gonna pull the wheel in. The control arm is what's going to pull the wheel in or push it out. With a McPherson car, you're gonna have basically a near 1-to-1 motion ratio. What that means is if you have a 9K spring, the wheel basically has no mechanical advantage on it. So that 9K is basically a 9K to the wheel. Whereas with a Miata, for example, you can see how the shock is mounted inboard from this pivot point down here, the ball joint, right? So what that does is that gives the wheel a mechanical advantage over the shock. So it has a leverage advantage. It is easier for it to push the shock here than it would be out here. So on a Miata, the motion ratio is a little above 0.7 in the front, a little below 0.7 in the rear. So we'll just use 0.7 for round numbers. So let's say I had a 10K in the front. That would mean with the motion ratio factored in, it's only a 7K in the front. Let's say I have a 5K in the rear. It's really only a 3.5K. My 4K is really only about a high 2K, right? Motion ratio is very, very important. It is important to understand how it works and factor that into your comparisons. You can ride in your friend's IS300 with a 24K and say, okay, I like the way this feels, but you need to do the math and figure out, okay, well, that's with a 0.6 motion ratio, so that's really like a 16K effective and the car weighs this, so like that would be like a 14 on a 240. So same thing with drift spec setups. So just something to keep in mind with all of this. So how do you choose spring rate, shock length, valving for a drift car? So we've gone over the general idea of what you want to choose. Coming up with a baseline rate is really just going to be a factor of people with experience with the same car, doing some formulas, coming up with an idea. Okay, people generally like a 0.5 rear and a 1 front for drifting, right? And then using the formulas to do that. Gets a little complicated. Most coilover companies are gonna have experience in this. Like you call it BC and they know drift spec setups for pretty much any chassis, and that idea can translate for the most part to any chassis. Some cars are weird. This car is a little weird because it's a short wheelbase and it's a little twitchy. So I'm going to be doing some things with the spring rate of this car that you might not do with a 240 or 350Z or something, because I'm trying to counteract a little bit of that twitchiness and a little bit of that snappiness with my suspension setup, which we'll get into in a minute. So you've picked your baseline rate. Now it's time to test it. You need to go test it. A lot of people think that there's a one-size-fits-all rate that's going to be comfortable, handle great, drift great, etc. If you really want a car to be dialed in for a certain thing, it's pretty much only going to be dialed in for that certain thing. And to get it there, you have to do testing. You have to go figure it out. So I thought these rates would be ideal for this car. They're not. After testing, they're not. The rear might be okay. The rear 4K, the car sits really low with the 4K, and that's really my main problem here. Like, I've already messed up my rear bumper just from it dragging on the ground. So I'm gonna stick with the 4K in the rear for now, because it should net me the most grip, depending. So that's what I want. So we're gonna leave 4K in the rear. The front, however, has too much front grip, too much front dive, too much front roll. So we have a bigger sway bar, still not solving our problem. So at this point, we could go with the bigger sway bar, but my problem is also dive. The car, if I left foot brake, if I chuck it into a corner, the car, when it's loading up the front, it's just diving really hard, and that's causing the rear to unload, and it's causing all sorts of a domino effect of the car being too snappy and twitchy and things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase my front spring rate to try to negate some of that dive, to try to keep the car from wanting to weight transfer to the front, because our end game is to transfer as much weight as we can to the back of the car, because that will net us the most grip. We still want to make sure that while doing so, we still have good front grip. We don't want to kill our front grip completely in the name of rear grip. It becomes a bit of a balancing act where you have to pick and choose and try to find the best in between for both things, because you could have a ton of rear grip and no front grip, and like maybe your car is faster than other people's, but you can't drive it because you can't steer well, and you end up running into people, or you can't get the car to drive on the line you need to make it go faster, or things like that. So there's always a give and take, basically, with your spring rates and your setup. So, okay, enough jibber jabbering. Let's pull the front coilovers out, kind of go over those, and I'll show you guys the spring rate swap and what that entails. Okay, we have the coilovers out. It was a bona fide struggle. These cars are really annoying to pull the coilovers out of the front, especially when you have super long shocks like I have. This side wasn't that bad. I just undid the upper control arm, and I was able to just pull the shock right out. The thing is, upper control arm bolts in here. This bolt has to go all the way out here over this sway bar bracket. There's like built-in nuts. And on this side, the head of the bolt hits the nut, and you can't pull the bolt all the way out. So I couldn't pull the control arm off. So I had to pull the sway bar off so that I could get the shock past the sway bar mount and jimmy it out. Needless to say, that's how your 15-minute coilover removal can turn into an hour and a half, which is how your I'm gonna change my spring rates in an hour can turn into I'm gonna change my spring rates in 4 hours. So always budget for that. Always budget for extra time. Okay, let's start ripping into these things. So these are our 12K springs. You can see a difference in the coil diameter. I don't know if you can tell in the video. Yeah, you can tell. So see how much thicker the coils are and how many more of them there are. So that's another factor, is when you increase spring rate in the same length, you run into issues where you have less spring stroke. So you might have enough shock travel, but the spring will bind on itself. There's a lot of factors. Like I said, we're gonna make a everything you need to know about coilovers video. Take too long to explain all that in this video. But we are gonna swap these springs, very easy to do. I will run you through it. All right, so spring swaps are pretty easy. We're breaking all the lock rings loose, the spring lock rings and the lower mount lock rings, because we'll need to adjust ride height and preload. Take the top nut off, pull the top plate off, pull the spring off. Easy peasy. Got the new spring on. Put the top plate back on. Put the top nut back on. Tighten the top nut back down. Just kind of a little tricky. Usually got to hold the plate against something so it doesn't just spin, and that's it. So these new springs are a little shorter than our old springs, so we need to reset the preload. If they were the same length, we wouldn't need to do this, but since they are shorter, we've got to move those lock rings up. So we are also going to lower the ride height, because since we're going up to a stiffer spring, the car is naturally going to sit higher. We then lock everything back down, put the damping knob on, and we are done. All right, got the coilovers back in with the spring rate change. Only annoying thing about trying to get your ride height dialed in is you kind of got to drive the car around to get it to settle and see what the ride height's actually going to be, because when we set it down, it might be a ½ inch higher than it's gonna settle. The stiffer the spring, generally the less it'll settle. The softer the spring, the more it'll settle. So yeah, with these 4Ks, gotta raise the crap out of it. So we're gonna raise this up as high as we can, which I don't think is much higher. And then see how it is. All right, so this is what we've got before settling. So before we go drive it, I wanna talk about a couple more things drift car suspension setup wise. I mean, we've got a few more things to cover, but sway bars, kind of simple. My experience in general, big stiff front sway bar, soft like stock rear bar, maybe a light upgrade, but you definitely want to go bigger with the front. In my experience, the car drives the best that way. It's most predictable. Some people run no rear bar. I personally don't like no rear bar because having the rear sway bar, the car is a little bit more responsive to your input. So you go to like flick the car into a corner, it'll get that like snap from your inputs better. Whereas when you have no rear, it kind of likes to soak that up. And especially when we're running super soft rear rates like I have on here, you guys know it's like almost a 3 or so. The Z, I have a 4, which effective is somewhere around there because it's basically 1-to-1. So with those kind of crazy low spring rates, it equates to like really, really weird characteristics without a sway bar. Some people run no front sway bar because of their, angle kit or something like that, but like Wisefab, which isn't designed to run a front sway bar, they modify the roll center and things like that to help negate the fact of you not having a front sway bar. Like I had PBM on my car and I drove it without a front sway bar for a while because it didn't have one and I hated it. Put sway bars on the car, far better. So, I mean, general consensus of sway bar is big front, stock rear, or small rear. Now, alignment. People think there's some magic camber setting. There's not, right? So this car with really soft spring rates and stuff, I'd probably run maybe as much as ½ a degree positive in the rear, because when the car squats down, it's going to gain some camber and that'll flatten the tires out. The difference lies in your suspension design. So some cars, like an E36 for example, has a lot of camber and toe gain. So as the suspension compresses more and more, it gains more and more camber. So like this car has camber gain, but it's not that crazy. I'm not sure what the exact figures are, but it might be like a degree or two over like 3-4 inches. So nothing crazy, so you don't have to do too much to account for that. 240s, you can extend your traction arm, which changes the relationship of basically the upper and lower arms, and then that equates to like less camber and toe gain. But regardless, your camber is going to depend on that. So when you're setting camber, it's gonna vary. I mean, even like track for track, it's different for tire wear, because that's pretty much what I set mine for, is to get the most life out of the tire, to get even wear across the tire. So, and then you're most likely getting the most grip if you're doing that. So, for example, even on like the OSW skid pad, 2 different layouts, you might run 2 different alignments. So, if there's one layout that's a good mix of both directions, I might be able to run just a standard alignment, maybe 0 degrees of camber, ½ a degree of negative camber, and be fine and get perfect tire wear. But if it's a track where let's say it's all left and there's like a quick little right, in that situation, I might have to run negative on the outside wheel and positive on the inside wheel, because when the car is rolling over, the outside wheel is leaning out and you're going to wear the outside, and the inside wheel is leaning in, you're going to wear the inside. Camber is really going to be a factor of the track conditions, your car, your tires. Some tires like Kendas like to wear the outside, so sometimes I have to run a little more negative camber to try to keep that wear off the outside. So as far as rear camber goes, I mean, I would say anywhere between +1 and -2 is probably going to be your range. Other than that, it's going to depend. You're just going to have to, try it out. You can go through like one set of tires and get it dialed in just as you're wearing through and you're seeing where it's wearing, change it. Toe, pretty simple concept here too. In the rear, 0 toe to toe in. You're pretty much never going to run toe out. You don't want toe out. 0 toe, best life out of the tire. Toe in, you're going to get more grip. I mean, the most toe in I think you'd want to ever run would be like ½ inch. Some people have run like an inch to try to get all the grips, but if you're going to run toe in, you'll probably be at like an 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, ½ inch on the extreme. Benefit, like I said, is more grip. The downfall is you're going to wear through the tires faster, because you got to imagine, if you don't know what toe is, it's basically how close the front of the wheels are to each other. So if the front of the wheels are the same distance apart as the rear of the wheels, then you have 0 toe. If the front of the wheels are closer than the rear, you have toe in. If the front of the wheels are farther, you have toe out, right? So with no toe, tire's rolling straight. Toe in, you have friction, you have that resistance of it, the tire almost like kind of dragging because it's turned in. So that'll equate to better grip, but more tire wear. So in terms of the rear, I mean, that's pretty much it. Caster's kind of like not really a thing in the rear. It exists, but it doesn't really matter for anything. I mean, on Miatas, there's always like a lot of forward caster. So the wheel is really far forward in the fender well, and sometimes it'll rub. So, I mean, maybe you would equate for that if you could. But I mean, it's not really something you set in the rear. So in the front, another factor where camber is not a all-in-one, one-size-fits-all kind of deal. So generally, McPherson cars, you need a good bit of camber because they gain a lot of positive camber as they go through the sweep because of the KPI. So basically, you'll run negative camber so that when you're in drift and the car is at angle, the wheel is flat. But that equates to you having negative camber when the wheel is straight. So on a double A-arm car like this, or like I don't even know what you would call a Z front suspension because it's not quite double A-arm. But a car that's not McPherson strut, usually you can get away with less camber. I'm running like 4.5 degrees, and I could probably honestly run even less. You don't really ever need to run more on a A-arm car. Caster. So caster again is, I mean, it's basically the angle. Like imagine you've got your upper ball joint or where your shock mounts up here. You've got your lower ball joint or where your knuckle mounts down here. So if it's straight up, 0 degrees of caster. The more it tilts, the more caster you have, right? So generally, drift car, you're gonna run 6 to 7 degrees of caster. That's gonna get you into the self-steer range and help the car as the weight starts to load up. It'll just want to steer itself out to angle. 5 and below, and the car is gonna start not really wanting to steer itself when you throw it in a drift. So you come into a corner, chuck it in, you kind of let go of the wheel, let the wheel do its thing, and the wheel's just kind of gonna want to stay where it is. It's not gonna want to follow what the car needs it to do. Watch the wheel. It just doesn't turn. So again, that's going to be user preference and things like that. And then toe. This is kind of up for debate, really. So some people will tell you toe in, some people will tell you toe out. No toe is for street. I usually run a little bit of toe out. That's what I'm used to. It kind of helps the car snap into the self-steer. But I mean, I haven't really experimented much with toe in my experience. Toe in, like you don't kind of get that snappiness. On a car like a Miata, it honestly might be beneficial to run toe in because they are pretty snappy, but at the same time, it might keep it from countersteering fast enough and be even worse. So it's kind of hard to say with alignment. I guess I didn't give you guys a lot of answers there because it really does just depend a lot on your driving style, what you like, your car setup. I mean, even same car, but different tires and different power level, different weight balance. I mean, all of that stuff is going to be a big factor. We'll go over it from the top. Either default front rate that would come with a normal set of coilovers, or maybe a little stiffer, especially a little stiffer if you don't have a sway bar, not too crazy. Rear, softer than what would come default on a coilover set, like maybe even super soft depending on how much travel you can get and your weight balance and your tire and things like that. I mean, you might go too soft and have too much shock stroke and be slamming your wheel up into your fender well, and that's not gonna be good. Again, if you're bottoming out, null and void, doesn't matter how good it is until it bottoms out. If you're bottoming it out consistently, it's like infinite spring rate, not good, right? So yeah, so softer rear, stiffer front, general rule of thumb. I like digressive shocks. There's debate on that in the rear as to whether a digressive or a linear would be better. We won't get into that. We'll get into that in coilovers. Sway bars, big front, soft rear. Notice the theme here. Soft rear stuff, stiff front stuff makes the car have rear grip bias, which is what you want because that makes it faster in drift. There's people that haven't really been into drifting or don't know a ton about drifting. There's kind of a common misconception there that you want minimal grip, but you don't. You want generally as much grip as the car can handle and your power level can handle. If you don't make enough power, you're not going to be able to use that grip level. You know, like with the Z's, we run a lot of grip on the skid pad because the skid pad doesn't have a ton of grip itself. But then if I try to drive the oval with my same skid pad setup, I can't even keep the car in drift. I have to take grip out. So basically, you're going to want to grip it up to the level of your comfort zone and what the car can handle power-wise. What I like to do is I like to set my car up to have a lot of mechanical grip, so the suspension is doing a lot of the work as far as making grip and putting the power down, and then that way I have more leeway with tires. So I'm not relying on a good sticky tire to get me grip. I'm relying on the suspension, and then I have more options. I can run a 205 and maybe still have enough grip. Grip out of the suspension as much as possible. Always easier to take grip out than it is to add grip in. So you can only go so low in tire pressure, but you can go super high with tire pressure. I mean, I could pump these up to 60 and the car would be like it's on ice, but I can't air them down past, 8 to 10. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much my preference with it. I think the car is good. We're gonna go drive it. All right, so we covered the baseline setup, but keep in mind a baseline setup is just that. It's your baseline. It is going to change. Maybe it's good right out of the box, but just because it's good right out of the box doesn't mean you shouldn't work to improve it. You shouldn't try things. So maybe you're used to an 1/8 inch toe out, right? So you start there, car feels good. Maybe try no toe. Maybe try a little toe in. Maybe try a little more toe out. See how the car drives. You might think it drives good, and then it could drive way better. So perfect example is this car. We're gonna kind of go over what the testing showed, what we changed, and then how we got the car to where it is now. So we went to the first event and the car was not self-steering at all. At all. It just could not get it to self-steer. All right, so pay attention to how much I'm kind of on top of the wheel. As you see, when we come up to the transition, I've got to walk it around to get it to not spin out. And then we come to this next one, same thing. I've got to feed it all the way around myself to make it. Now on this one, I'm trying to do the same thing. You can see I'm slapping all over the wheel. We come through this one. I try to chuck it. Can't get it to spin fast enough. Still spin out. And I just kept fighting it and fighting it. I mean, first it was too much toe out. We set the toe right. That helped. We tried toe in, toe out, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. We tried higher tire pressure, different front tires, less tire pressure. And we were really struggling to try to get it to work right. So I believed the alignment stands that I used, like the bolt-on ones, and they gave us a really inaccurate reading. So my caster was what was wrong. That's why it's important to go to an actual alignment shop, which I didn't have time to do, to get your baseline alignment, especially caster, because caster's kind of a hard thing to measure accurately, like at home, right? So once we set the caster right, we added caster. You can basically, on this car, you can add caster in two places. You can push the back of the arm out, pushes basically the bottom of the hub forward, and then you can pull the front in, which does, effectively the same thing. So we maxed it out on the back, car drove much better. God, this thing has so much grip. Oh, it's way better now though. Yes! Oh my God, it works! Oh, and I dry linked it without feeling like I was gonna die the whole time. The whole thing was caster! The whole time was freaking caster! All I had to do was check the caster. Much better. It went from being like virtually undrivable to drivable, but it still wasn't self-steering as much as I'd want. I still had to help it a good bit, so I figured we just needed to add a little more caster with the front eccentric. So we came home, added some more front caster, changed some other things on the car, went back out to the event. Lo and behold, still not enough self-steer. So I was kind of driving through it, but if you watch, like you can watch when we go to initiate here, see the wheel's not turning very fast. I'm kind of having to help it a little bit. Then as we come up to the transition here, you'll see it self-steers a little, but I still kind of have to walk it, especially this one. See, I've got to kind of throw the wheel because it's a tight, quick transition. So we're still having kind of the same issue, just not as bad. Still not self-steering right. So I drive the whole event, and it's drivable. The car's drivable. It's just not confidence inspiring because I can't just like let go of the wheel on transition. I've got to be really on top of it, which is kind of making me hesitate and all that stuff. So car setup is a really big factor in your driving ability. If the car is not set up well, it's going to be hard to drive it at its limits. If the car is set up really well and you can drive it second nature, then you're good to go. You're going to be able to drive a lot better because you're not focusing on driving the car. You're driving the car naturally, and everything else you've got to do, you know, left foot braking behind somebody and transitioning timing and line, and you can focus on all that stuff, not, okay, I got to shuffle the wheel for this transition. That brings me to kind of the last thing I want to talk about, something very, very important too. Your alignment isn't the only thing that could cause the car to drive weird. So I have seen before, this car is a little different because it's double A-arm in the rear, so the only thing we could really have is the bushings binding up. But I've seen cars like the Z. We got a bunch of control arms in the back, bunch of spherical joints. A really good test to do is to take your shock out, jack up your suspension all the way through the range, all the way up to like max compression, down to full droop, and see if you have any instances where it's binding, there's a hard spot. You know, I've seen cars, people were trying all different stuff, different spring rates, different shocks, different shock brands. They couldn't figure out. The car just like wasn't making the right amount of grip. They did that, found out halfway through the compression cycle, it was completely binding up and not going any further. So it was like infinite spring rate because it's basically locking up, so the suspension stops doing anything. So that is hugely important to check. You want to make sure that all of your arms are functioning correctly and not binding. You're not getting crazy like toe and camber gain. If you are, that'll help you kind of identify, okay, this thing when it squats gains like 2 degrees of negative camber, so therefore I need to have about this much so that when it squats it fixes itself. Is one issue we ran into with this car. So something that was weird was that it was really hard to turn the wheels. Like if I wanted to grab this wheel and turn it by hand, I had to grab 2 hands to turn it. So me and Ben spent 2 days, tore into this thing. We took the steering rack out, which is not an enjoyable job because, as you can see, the dry sump lines go right over it. I had to undo the dry sump lines and barely snakes out by the pan. I mean, it is not fun. So we changed the rack, it didn't get any better. We started messing with it, and we realized it was definitely the steering shaft binding, because once the steering shaft was disconnected, it is still heavy to turn, but it was okay. So what we did was we took the steering shaft out, we took the header out, we ground the header down, ground the steering shaft down, put a new steering shaft in it that spun a little better, like a new column. And the biggest thing, the number one problem we were having is there's a grommet that goes through the firewall, and to get the steering shaft to clear the headers, you have to bend the bracket over at the bottom. So I'll show you that clip right now. So we ended up having to remove the boot, basically, that's at the firewall, bend this bracket over, which was previously bent over, pull the header out, regrind the header down, grind the steering shaft down, and all of those things combined gave us clearance. So we were binding on the rubber boot at the firewall, and we were binding on the header. So now that both of those are fixed, there's no more resistance with the steering shaft connected versus disconnected at the wheel. We still have some resistance at the ball joints. Like even with the tie rods completely disconnected, it's still kind of stiff. But it's a million times lighter right now than it was. So yeah, that's all it was. So we took it out and tested it, and it drove so much better. So I am super hyped on how it's driving now, but that's a really good example of testing. You know, you can have perfect baseline settings, but if you don't get it aligned at a shop, you might not know if they're right. I use home alignment stuff all the time, but it's really good for fixing an alignment, changing little things, but setting up your initial alignment, not ideal because your thrust angle might be wrong. Like you might have no toe, but both wheels are pointed sideways, so the car's crab walking, all those things. So in summary, baseline alignment, go to a shop. 2, change things. Make sure to try different things. You might think the car is driving good enough, but it might be able to drive way better. So change things, try things. Figure out what you like and what you don't like and how they affect the car, how toe in, how toe out, you know, more caster, less caster, camber. Figure out how all of that affects the car, and you'll be much better able to set the car up. And thing number 3, check your suspension components. Jack it up through the range, turn the wheels in the air and see if it's heavy to turn. Check all of that stuff as well. That should be in your initial setup. I didn't think it was gonna be a problem, the steering being kind of heavy. I thought it was, you know, just was what it was. It wasn't. Just because there's a V8 in it. Steering's actually super light. It just was binding up on the bushing through the firewall. So especially like if you've done like this build, you know, we put a whole new angle kit on it. I saw a lot of comments like, oh, it's probably that angle kit, like maybe it's the knuckles, like have you figured, you know, have you tried different knuckles? And it's really easy to blame the new parts. Well, this is what changed. Now it's got this angle kit on it, so it's gotta be that. Honestly, rarely is the case. Rarely that's the case. It's usually something else. So always check thoroughly, check, you know, everything you can. Go through your suspension with a fine tooth comb. If you're having issues, and if everything else is set up correctly and you're still having issues, there's probably something wrong that needs to be rectified. But don't just jump to conclusions blaming parts, because it usually isn't the parts. So anyway, that's about as complete of a guide as I can get for you know, you guys setting up your suspension. It worked out that we did have some issues with the Miata, so you could see exactly kind of what it entails. You know, you might have a great baseline, but it still might not work right. So always requires some dialing in and all of that stuff. So anyway, if you guys found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more of this kind of content, let me know. And let me know your thoughts. What are your drift car suspension setups? What do you like? What do you not like? You know, how do you set your car up, and how does it react? You know, if you've got it set up a certain way, how does it drive compared to maybe another drift car? So anyway, I guess that's going to be it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.